Hey guys, welcome to Hip Hughes History. We're so glad that you showed up for some learning because I'm getting ready to serve some learning. We're specifically going to hit up the New Deal for you guys today. It's going to be on the test, I promise you. Whether you're in middle school, high school, college, it's going to be on the test. And if you're cray-cray on the internet, it's going to come in handy one day, I promise you. I don't know when. So sit back and relax. Let's see if we can't do some brain wrinkling for you. Ding dong, get the door, learning's here. Alright guys, we're not going 15 layers under the covers in history here guys. We're going to hit major concepts and major vocabulary. If you're going to do some major research, you need to do some major research. So FDR is elected president in 1932, replacing the Republican Herbert Hoover. FDR is a Democrat. And the major concept, and this is probably true today, is that the Republican Herbert Hoover, when the Great Depression hit, really operated in a laissez-faire model. And that's not completely true. People are going to be posting below. He did raise taxes, and he did have a tariff acts passed, and he did try some rescue techniques to get us out of the Great Depression. But in the American public's eyes, and that's what's important when it comes to voting day, he wasn't doing enough. Towns popped up, homeless places, and they called them Hoovervilles. The bonus army is really kind of, attacked outside of Washington, D.C. by Hoover and the military, really showing the American people, in their view, that Hoover is out of touch, that Hoover doesn't understand them, that Hoover and laissez-faire economics need to step aside. Besides it being dry and him being a prohibitionist, which wasn't very popular either. So FDR really represents hope. He represents change. And with 25% unemployment, I think that Alfred E. Neumann could get elected. I just made someone Google Alfred E. Neumann. But nevertheless, FDR wins like with 60% of the vote. And you can tell that the concept is hope when in his first inauguration address, you've heard that before. There he is. I'm going to let him say.
The only thing we have to fear is
true. It is.
fear itself.
Yeah, that's the line, man. That's the line that says that I am hope, that we are turning the corner. And, people are going to argue about this for years. Did the New Deal, which we're going to discuss in length in a moment here, work? And historians are really divided on that question. In 1940, unemployment was still like 19-20%. Some historians would argue that it was World War II that got us out. Other historians would argue that if FDR didn't do the New Deal, it might have gotten even worse. We might have been leading ourselves into revolution. And there's other historians that claim that he didn't go far enough, that he started scaling back the New Deal in 36, 38. But we're not going to go crazy. That's for you guys in the comments below and at the dinner tables. We're going to stick to the facts, the big ideas of what occurred. So get a can of alphabet soup because we're going to open up and dump a whole bunch of letters on your heads right now. Here we go. Alright, they're called alphabet soup programs because they all have initials, crazy initials. And we're not going to go linear chronological here because really the first thing he did was close all the banks. But we're just going to stick to legislation. It is important to understand that FDR is a Democrat and that Congress is Democratic, which means that in a sense, this fist that he uses really has legislative and executive power. So if he wants to do something, he has that ability pretty much to do what he wants because Congress writes laws and he passes laws. The only one that has the power to stop him is the Supreme Court. And we'll talk about court packing in a little while and why I like to punch my hand like that. So let's look at unemployment programs. We're going to divide it up. Unemployment programs, right? Economic programs and safety net programs. So I hope you're ready because I'm ready. Let's go. All right, the unemployment programs are up on the wall. We're going to take them one at a time. We're going to do TVA, CCC, and WPA. So let's start with the TVA. Sometimes I'll use a little bit of an accent, just as long as my kids get right into it there, that I'm talking about the rural South. And I don't want to be offensive, because certainly that could be offensive, I know. But saying it that way might throw you at least into the movie Deliverance. That's what I'm trying to do. The concept is that part of the country, and specifically the Appalachian Mountain Range there, really is underdeveloped. It's not modernized like most of America in terms of electricity and transportation routes. And that really, in FDR's view, is hindering their growth. So him waiting on private enterprise to invest their money into this region that is underdeveloped, in his mind, isn't going to happen. And in a New Dealer's mind, a progressive or a liberal mind, they're thinking, what can the government do to get this jump started? And that's where they differ from like a libertarian or a laissez-faire economist that would say the government's just going to mess it up. The government should stay out of it and let society kind of fix itself. But FDR doesn't believe that, so he's going to pass the TVA, he's going to sign it, and Congress is going to pass it. So the Tennessee Valley Authority is a program to modernize the Appalachian Valley. It's a program to dam up the rivers which flooded and would destroy much of that land down there. It creates electricity and provides jobs, and that electricity is going to be able to modernize that area, which is going to allow for more business investment and economic growth. That's the idea. This is called pump spending. I think I can do this a little bit. That the government, in a sense, is pumping this money into that region in order to fill it up, to allow it to grow by itself, if that makes any sense. The CCC is going to be on the test. That's the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Civilian Conservation Corps specifically targeted unemployment in cities. And African American unemployment was like 80%. It was cray. Cray is the word of the day, by the way. But it took 18 to 25-year-old young men, and it basically kind of shipped them out into more rural areas, country areas, where they would clear trails and clean beaches and improve the environment. And then the money would be sent back, some of the money, to their elders, to their grandparents or parents in cities. And the concept, again, is you have a multitude of fixes here. You're cleaning up the environment, you're creating national parks and such like that. And that money, besides these people not being, in crime now or doing bad things, but they're employed, they're paying taxes, and that money is being pumped right back into the infrastructure of the cities because their grandparents or their parents are spending that money. And therefore, we're filling that balloon. It's that pump spending idea, and that people they'll spend and create jobs, and eventually you won't need the government to get this thing done. And then lastly, you have the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which is just filled to the brim with jobs programs that built things across the country, including a lot of jobs for artists and sculptors. So get those under your skull right now. Here are the unemployment programs. Say them with me. TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, right? CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. And finally, we have the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. So go get a safety net, because I see someone on one of those trapeze things. They're going to fall to the ground and die. Die, I tell you. So these are your economic safety net programs that are basically there in order to make sure that when people fall on hard times or in vulnerable positions in society, that the government is going to create the safety net where there's like a minimum standard of living, basically. And before this, churches and volunteer organizations were really in charge of what we would call the indigents of society, or people who couldn't take care of themselves. So one of these programs is FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Act. Today that's FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I might have messed that up, but basically this is when you're hit with a natural disaster. You might be affected by the Dust Bowl, which is beyond your control, unless you were part of the overproduction problem that ruined the soil and helped to contribute to the problem of the Dust Bowl. But if it's a hurricane, or if it's a tornado, or if it's a comet, the idea is that the government, through taxpayer money and this FERA organization, is going to be able to give you basic services so you can pick your feet up and you can get started again. The other one is a really important one, and you can argue till the cows come home about this one, but that would be SSA, SSI, Social Security Insurance. The Social Security Act created the program we now know today as Social Security, and we're just going to call it for what it is, a safety net program. And look, there's complicated ways that it's funded, and people are going to talk about it running out of money and what's the next step, and that's all good for other lectures, but right now we need to know the very basics. SSA is for those workers retired 65 and older, and for the handicapped, to provide them with basic subsistence of living, some type of payment. And again, the funding is a little bit more complicated than we're giving away here. But the safety net programs, right? First we have FERA, and now we have SSA. So if you're hit by a hurricane, or if you're old and handicapped in a hurricane, you're set. Here we go. right, the other ones we're going to call economic security programs because they're really confidence programs. One of the biggest problems in the Great Depression is people don't have confidence in the economic institutions of the United States anymore. And if you don't have confidence, you're not going to invest. And if you're not going to invest, you're not going to grow. And if you're not going to grow, businesses aren't going to invest back in America. And then you have like a double-edged sword, catch-22, where you just punch yourself in the face. That would suck. So what FDR wants to do is really boost confidence. So the two things that he did to do this, and again, Congress passes them and FDR signs them. Number one would be the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission. And this is really to shore up confidence in the stock market. People weren't investing money in the stock market. There was a lot of games going on back then, still are, that led a lot of Americans kind of to the idea that they shouldn't put their money in the stock market, that no one is regulating it, no one is oversighting it, that it's really the wild, wild west, and unless you're an insider or you have some type of rich connection, that you're just going to get burned. And margin buying did that in the Great Depression. There was a lot of game playing with margin buying, and a lot of people invested a lot of money in the stock market in the middle class, and when the bottom fell out, they fell out with it. So they're not going back to the stock market, not until the SEC comes to town. And the SEC is the idea, basically in class I say the stock cops, Martha Stewart, right? Where they're going to watch transactions, and if there's funny business, that's going to get regulated, and there's going to be criminal penalties, and you can feel good about the stock market. The other one is banks, and that's probably the most important one. And I had SEC on the screen that I forgot. But the other one, watch this, is the FDIC. And this is really to ensure confidence in the banking system again. Like I said before, one of the first things that FDR did was he closed the banks across the country for 4 or 5 days, really in order to gather up confidence, to tell people, I'm going to do something about this problem. And of course, the problem is that banks are uninsured. So during the Great Depression, there are thousands of banks closing all across the country. And if your bank closes and your money's in the bank when the bank closes, PU, that stinks. You're going to lose your money. So therefore, people are putting their money in their mattresses. I would too. I'm not going to go to the damn bank and go to Fred's bank. Fred might take off. Fred going to declare bankruptcy, take my money, and take his wife to Tahiti. Goodness gracious. So the FDIC, or the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation, is a government agency to insure your deposits. Back then it was $5,000, like $100,000 today. But the idea is get your money back in the bank. And if your money's back in the bank, right, then the bank is going to be able to loan that money out, which is going to stimulate the economy and create investment and an expansive economy. So we're almost done, guys. My voice is getting hoarse. We got some other things to teach you. But so far, we've gone through the major programs. We're going to take a look at a couple of unconstitutional programs, and we might throw union reform into the mixture just because it's fun. All right, the last one that I didn't really put into a category before we do your unconstitutional programs and I get to punch my hand is going to be the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act, or the National Labor Standards Act, is going to create basically the concept of collective bargaining in the country. That the government is going to be an arbitrator between big business and labor unions in order to give labor unions a fair share, a shake at the table. And of course, before this, unions are very much not illegal, but they don't have any bargaining power. All they have is the strike, and the strike a lot of times leads to violence and losses for the union. So FDR is going to act as the arbitrator of the government in collective bargaining. All right, so 2 programs are going to get stopped by that Supreme Court, and we'll talk about how that leads to court packing. One would be the AAA. The AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, was basically to deal with the problem of overproduction. Overproduction creates lower prices, and farmers have this problem throughout the 20s, where through new mechanicalized agriculture and them kind of expanding their farms and taking loans out to do so, are creating an overabundance of crops. Therefore, when you have an overabundance of supply and demand isn't increasing, the price is going to crash. So therefore, you've taken a loan out, right? You've spent that money to expand your crop. You've overproduced, and now you're making less money than when you took the loan out. And you can't pay the loan back. And now you're living in a van down by the side of the river. That's the problem. So how am I going to get you to stop growing so much food? I'm going to subsidize you. I'm going to pay you not to grow. And that was done through a tax on processors. And that's where the unconstitutionality comes in. But that's not what's as important as the idea that FDR is pissed. He like, yo, what you doing, man? I'm trying to fix the car, and you come in, you put a monkey wrench. So in his mind, he's thinking already by 1936, what can I do to get around this? The second is the NRA, and that was pretty much the biggest of his reform programs, the National Recovery Act, which really gave the government a really strong role in centralized economic planning using the Interstate Commerce Clause. And this went as far as sometimes setting pricing. And basically, this is a bigger decision than the AAA because the Supreme Court's going to say, not going to do that. The Interstate Commerce Clause doesn't give you the right to regulate prices and to expand your power beyond the Constitution. And that's where FDR flips his lid. And he comes up with this plan. And now we're going to do it. Let's punch our hand. Punch your hand! All right, court packing is going to be on the test. I promise you. I got $5. I'm just kidding. But basically the concept is that he comes up with a plan, and there's another video on this, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it. But basically to increase the number on the Supreme Court. And Congress would write the legislation, he would sign it, and then he'd be a gangster. He'd be a gangster because he appoints the Supreme Court. So of course this is going to be good for him. He's trying to change the rulings. And this is a violation, at least in spirit, of separation of powers and checks and balances. And it's a long story, but at the end of the day, he's not going to get his wishes. And if you look at some of those cartoons, you can see that a lot of Americans saw this really as a road to tyranny, to dictatorship, to too much power. And that brings us to one of the last things, which is the major criticisms of the New Deal. Well, the major criticisms come, number one, from the constitutionalists, who are going to argue that this is beyond the scope of the government's power to regulate the economy, that you are violating, in a sense, the 10th Amendment and reserve powers and trying to fix things you weren't supposed to be fixing. Number two would be that this is really approaching socialism. Status, centralized planning. Libertarians would argue that this is the road to socialism. That people should be in charge of their own lives. That if anything, localities and cities and states should be regulating and organizing society, but not done by bureaucrats in Washington who are removed from the problem. Third is deficit spending. And this is today where the budget hawks would come into play, saying that these are great ideas, but you don't got the money. So you're going to borrow money to fix the problem. That's really great. And then you're going to eventually run out of money and you're going to have a money problem. So deficit spending, and FDR and Democrats and even some Republicans don't think that way. They would say that, look, you're stimulating the economy by borrowing the money, and that's going to lead to increased revenues and taxes, and therefore you're actually going to be able to stimulate the economy in a way to pay back the deficit, and I'm just talking too much. So there you go, guys. Basic New Deal stuff. Regulation. You got all these alphabet soup policies. The concept of court packing, socialism, debt and deficit spending. It's all there. Now, you probably should go take a nap, because I'm going to take a nap right now. Alright guys, that's it. Make sure that you subscribe. If you didn't subscribe, what the hell are you doing? Hit the subscribe button. And then make sure you go underneath in the description and you're going to see tons of EDU gurus and EDU channels that'll wrinkle your brain till you're a little old lady or a little old man. How exciting is that? Where attention goes, energy flows, guys. I don't like to pout. I don't even like to shout. I don't even like sauerkraut, but hip use. So